On a quiet summer afternoon in a small suburban town, the kind where everyone knows everyone and secrets rarely stay hidden, an older gentleman named Harold stepped out of a modest coffee shop. Harold, with his silver-streaked hair and a quiet confidence that seemed almost regal, was a man of few words. He preferred to keep to himself, savoring the little joys of life, like his morning espresso or the walk back to his cozy home just a few blocks away. Harold's demeanor was unassuming. Clad in a simple button-up shirt, slacks, and a well-worn pair of loafers, he looked like just another retiree enjoying the slower pace of life. What no one in the town knew, not even his closest neighbors, was that Harold had spent over 3 decades serving his country as an undercover CIA operative. His years of service had taken him to the most dangerous corners of the globe, where he had faced threats that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. But those days were behind him. Now, all Harold wanted was peace. As Harold turned the corner onto Main Street, the faint hum of distant sirens broke the midday stillness. He paid it little mind at first. Sirens were common in any town. But the noise grew louder, closer, until a squad car screeched to a halt at the curb directly in front of him. 2 officers stepped out, their movements sharp and assertive. One of them, Officer Blake, was a man notorious in the community for his overly aggressive policing tactics and a reputation for taking things too far. His towering frame and ever-present scowl intimidated most people, and he liked it that way. Blake's partner, Officer Daniels, was younger and noticeably more reserved. He often seemed to follow Blake's lead, though it was clear he wasn't entirely comfortable with his senior's methods. Daniels cast a nervous glance toward Harold, who stood still, his expression calm but alert. "Hey you!" Blake barked, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. "What are you doing around here?" Harold blinked, surprised by the confrontation. "Just walking home," he replied evenly, his voice steady and polite. Blake wasn't satisfied with the answer. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, stepping closer. His hand rested on the holster of his weapon, a move Harold recognized as more performative than practical. Harold's eyebrows knitted together. "I think you've got the wrong person, officer," he said, maintaining his calm demeanor. "I've just come from the coffee shop." Blake's eyes narrowed, his suspicion turning into something more personal. "I don't like your tone," he snapped. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." For a moment, Harold hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the realization that this situation was escalating unnecessarily. He glanced at Daniels, hoping the younger officer might intervene, but Daniels looked away, his discomfort evident. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Harold said carefully. "I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to know what this is about." Blake didn't like being questioned. He stepped forward, shoving Harold against the side of the police car with unnecessary force. "I said, hands on the car," he growled. The bystanders on the street froze, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. Harold winced slightly as the impact jolted his shoulder. Years of training kicked in, urging him to stay composed, to assess the situation rather than react impulsively. Blake's voice dripped with contempt as he began to frisk Harold, searching for something, anything, that could justify his aggression. But Harold had nothing to hide. The retired CIA agent kept his life meticulously in order, a habit born from years of operating in the shadows. "Got any weapons on you? Drugs?" Blake sneered. "No, officer," Harold replied, his voice calm but firm. "I've done nothing wrong." Blake's frustration was palpable. He was a man who thrived on control, and Harold's composed demeanor was like sandpaper to his ego. As the seconds dragged on, Harold could feel the tension in the air growing thicker, the situation teetering on the edge of chaos. Then, Blake made a move that crossed the line. He shoved Harold again, harder this time, sending the older man sprawling to the ground. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Daniels took a hesitant step forward, his face etched with uncertainty, but Blake shot him a glare that stopped him in his tracks. Harold stayed on the ground for a moment, not because he couldn't get up, but because he was weighing his options. He had faced worse threats in his lifetime. But this was different. This was home. This was supposed to be the place where he didn't have to fight anymore. Finally, Harold rose to his feet, brushing the dirt from his clothes. He looked directly at Blake, his gaze steady and unyielding. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in Blake's eyes, not fear, but confusion. He had expected Harold to cower, to yell, to fight back, but Harold did none of those things. "You're making a mistake," Harold said quietly. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen more than most could fathom. Blake smirked, mistaking Harold's warning for an empty threat. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can walk around like you own this town," he shot back. As Blake reached for his cuffs, ready to escalate the situation further, Harold's past caught up with him in a way he never anticipated. A shadow of his former life began to surface, and with it, the promise that this encounter was far from over. Harold stood there, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside him. Blake, still oblivious to the true nature of the man he was dealing with, yanked the cuffs from his belt with an air of smug authority. The crowd watching grew restless, murmurs spreading through the small gathering. Cell phones were raised higher, capturing every moment. Harold knew he had to keep his composure, but every instinct honed from years in the field told him this situation could spiral out of control in an instant. "I'm not resisting," Harold said, his voice measured. "There's no need for this." Blake scoffed. "Yeah, that's what they all say," he muttered, grabbing Harold's wrist with unnecessary force. For Harold, time seemed to slow. He had spent years in situations where every second counted, where a single misstep could mean the difference between life and death. He scanned Blake's posture, his grip, even the angle of the cuffs. Harold wasn't one to flaunt his skills, but he knew, if it came to it, he could disarm Blake in less than 3 seconds. Still, he held back, knowing any move would escalate the situation beyond repair. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his own holster. It was clear the young officer was caught between his duty and his conscience. His eyes flicked between Blake and Harold, as though silently pleading for the scene to de-escalate. Harold caught the hesitation and filed it away. Daniels might not be an ally, but he wasn't an enemy either, not yet. As Blake tightened the cuff around Harold's wrist, the older man let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh. He wasn't sighing out of fear or frustration. It was a release, a reminder to himself to stay calm. Harold had been in countless situations far more dangerous than this one. He wasn't about to let an overzealous cop throw him off balance. "You're making this worse for yourself," Blake growled, his voice dripping with authority. "For who?" Harold replied evenly, his eyes locking onto Blake's. The question hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. For the first time, Blake hesitated. It was only for a split second, but Harold noticed. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment. A woman in her mid-30s stepped forward from the crowd. Her name was Carla, a local school teacher and one of the few people in town who wasn't afraid to speak her mind. She had seen enough and wasn't about to let this go on without saying something. "Officer," she began, her voice steady but firm, "this man hasn't done anything wrong. We've all been standing here watching. You're taking this too far." Blake turned to her, his irritation palpable. "Ma'am, I suggest you stay back. This is police business." "It's not police business," Carla shot back, her tone growing sharper. "It's harassment." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective unease starting to turn into something stronger. Blake's jaw tightened. He was losing control of the narrative, and he didn't like it. "You don't know what you're talking about," Blake snapped. But there was a crack in his voice now, a hint of uncertainty. Harold stood silent, watching the exchange. He could feel the energy shifting. The crowd was no longer just an audience. They were becoming participants. And Harold knew that the more eyes there were on Blake, the harder it would be for him to justify his actions. Meanwhile, Daniels finally found his voice. "Blake," he said quietly, his tone cautious. "Maybe we should call it in, just to be sure." Blake whipped around to face his partner, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "You questioning me now, Daniels?" Daniels hesitated, but he stood his ground. "I'm just saying, it doesn't hurt to double-check." Harold's gaze flipped to Daniels. The younger officer's words, though hesitant, were a small crack in Blake's authority. Harold could see that Daniels wasn't entirely on board with what was happening. And that was enough for him to keep pushing, subtly, of course. "You should listen to him," Harold said, his voice calm but firm. "It might save you from making a bigger mistake." Blake's face reddened. He was used to being in control, and the idea that he could be wrong, especially in front of a crowd, was something he couldn't stomach. "I don't need advice from you," he snapped, yanking the cuffs tighter. Harold winced slightly but didn't react further. He could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, their anticipation building. He had spent his life in the shadows, operating where no one could see him. But now, under the scrutiny of the public, he felt a different kind of pressure. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew heavier. Harold's mind raced, piecing together every detail he had observed. The way Blake carried himself, the dynamic between the two officers, the growing unrest of the crowd, it all painted a picture, and Harold knew how to use that picture to his advantage. "Blake," Daniels said again, his voice firmer this time, "we should really call this in." Blake turned to his partner, his anger flaring. "Fine," he snapped, pulling out his radio, "but don't think this changes anything." As Blake stepped away to make the call, Harold caught Daniel's eye. For a moment, neither of them said anything, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Daniels wasn't the enemy. He was just a kid trying to navigate a situation that was quickly spiraling out of control. "You don't agree with him," Harold said quietly, his voice low enough that only Daniels could hear. Daniels hesitated, then shook his head slightly. I don't think it has to go like this," he admitted. "It doesn't," Harold replied, "but that's up to you." Daniels looked at Harold, his expression conflicted. He wasn't sure what to make of the older man. There was something about him, something calm, confident, and entirely out of place in a situation like this. Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Harold than met the eye. Blake returned a moment later, his radio crackling with static. "Dispatch says no reports matching his description," he said, his voice tight with frustration, "but I'm not done here." Before Blake could continue, a voice from the crowd called out, "Leave him alone." It was Carla again, her voice strong and unwavering. The crowd began to echo her sentiment, their murmurs growing louder. Blake's jaw tightened, his frustration boiling over. But Harold knew the tide had turned. The crowd was on his side, and even Blake couldn't ignore that. For the first time, Harold allowed himself a small smile. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, the balance of power was shifting, and Harold was ready for whatever came next. Blake's knuckles tightened around the cuffs still clasped to Harold's wrist. His frustration was tangible, almost vibrating in the tense air between them. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were a growing force, emboldened by Carla's outburst and the hesitation in Daniel's demeanor. Blake could feel the control slipping through his fingers, and it infuriated him. Harold remained calm, though the sharp pinch of the cuffs reminded him of the countless times he had been restrained in his covert past. He had learned then that resistance wasn't always about fighting back. Sometimes, it was about waiting for the perfect moment to act. He wasn't just a retired man being harassed on a street corner. He was a tactician, and this was just another high-stakes situation to navigate. "You should be careful how you treat people, Officer Blake," Harold said, his voice calm yet carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs around them. "You never know who they are or what they're capable of." Blake sneered, leaning closer as if to establish dominance. "I don't care who you are, old man. Out here, you follow my rules." Daniels, standing a few feet away, flinched slightly at Blake's words. He looked at the growing crowd, then at Harold, then back to Blake. Something about this didn't sit right with him, but he was caught in a difficult position. Speaking out could cost him his job or, worse, make him a target for Blake's wrath. Yet, staying silent felt just as wrong. Meanwhile, Harold's mind raced. The situation had become more precarious, not just for him, but for everyone involved. Blake's aggression was predictable, but Daniel's was an unpredictable element. He was clearly torn, and Harold saw an opportunity there. If he could tip the younger officer just enough, it might change everything. "Young man," Harold said, addressing Daniels with deliberate calm, "I can see you're a man of reason. Think about this for a moment. Does this feel right to you? Daniels hesitated, glancing at Blake, who was now glaring at him with open suspicion. The younger officer opened his mouth, then closed it, visibly struggling to find the right words. I don't know, he admitted quietly. I just think we should handle this differently. Differently? Blake barked, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. You think you know better than me? This is how we handle things. We show control, or we lose it. Blake's words hung in the air, his attempt to reassert authority only fueling the tension. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their phones still pointed at the officers. Carla stepped forward again, her expression defiant. You're losing control right now, Blake, she said sharply. Everyone here can see it. Let him go before you dig yourself into a hole you can't climb out of. Blake's jaw clenched, his face reddening. He was teetering on the edge, and Harold could see it. But Harold also knew something else. Blake wasn't just reacting to the situation at hand. There was something deeper driving his behavior, some personal vendetta or frustration that had nothing to do with Harold himself. Harold had encountered men like Blake before, men who were desperate to prove themselves, even at the expense of their own integrity. Officer Blake, Harold said, his tone steady but edged with quiet authority. You and I both know this isn't about me. So what is it really about? Blake stiffened, caught off guard by the question. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Anger, yes, but also something darker. Regret? Shame? Harold couldn't be sure, but he filed it away as another piece of the puzzle. Whatever Blake was dealing with, it had taken control of him. And that made him dangerous. As the tension simmered, a black SUV rolled slowly down the street, its tinted windows reflecting the scene. The crowd turned to watch as the vehicle came to a stop a few yards away. Harold's sharp instincts kicked in, recognizing the subtle but deliberate way the SUV had approached. This wasn't a coincidence. The door opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was tall, clean-shaven, and carried himself with an air of authority that rivaled Blake's forced bravado. The man adjusted his cufflinks before walking toward the scene, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Is there a problem here? The man asked, his voice smooth and even, but with an undertone that demanded respect. Blake straightened, his grip on Harold loosening slightly. This is police business, he said, though his tone lacked its usual conviction. The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to Harold. Mr. Gray, he said, addressing Harold by name, are you all right? The crowd gasped softly, the revelation of Harold's last name sending ripples through the gathered onlookers. Blake blinked, confused. You know him, he stammered. The man's lips curved into a faint smile. Oh, I know him quite well, he said, his eyes narrowing slightly as they locked onto Blake's. And I suggest you think very carefully about how you proceed from here. Harold remained silent, but his mind was already working overtime. The man was clearly an ally, but his sudden appearance raised questions. Who had sent him? And why had he waited until now to intervene? Blake, visibly thrown off balance, released the cuffs with a frustrated sigh. Fine, he muttered. But this isn't over. Oh, it's very much over, the man said, his tone icy. For you. The implication was clear, and Blake's face darkened, but he didn't argue. He took a step back, glancing at Daniels, who looked both relieved and conflicted. The man turned to Harold, his expression softening. Mr. Gray, I trust you'll explain everything later. For now, let's get you out of here. Harold nodded, his gaze lingering on Blake for a moment before stepping away. The crowd began to disperse, their curiosity temporarily satisfied, but their phones still buzzing with messages and recordings. Harold knew this was far from over. Blake's ego had been bruised, and men like him didn't let things go easily. As Harold climbed into the SUV, he cast one last glance at Daniels, who met his gaze with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Harold gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the younger officer's internal struggle. The SUV pulled away, leaving Blake fuming on the sidewalk and the town buzzing with speculation. Inside the vehicle, Harold turned to the suited man, his expression serious. Who sent you? Harold asked, his tone sharp. The man smiled faintly, but his eyes were guarded. Let's just say some old friends are keeping an eye on you. Harold frowned, a sense of unease settling over him. His past had always been a tightly locked box, but it seemed the lid was beginning to crack open. And whatever was inside, he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. As the SUV rolled through the quiet streets, Harold kept his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, though his mind was elsewhere. The man in the tailored suit, who had introduced himself simply as Reed, sat beside him, his phone vibrating occasionally with messages Harold couldn't see. The air inside the vehicle was thick with unspoken tension, and Harold's instincts told him this wasn't just about the scene with Officer Blake. "Reed, you still haven't told me why you're here," Harold said finally, breaking the silence. His tone was calm, but edged with the authority of someone who wasn't used to being left in the dark. Reed glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say your past caught someone's attention. Someone who felt you might need assistance." Harold's jaw tightened. He had worked hard to leave his old life behind, to carve out a peaceful existence far from the shadows he once navigated. Yet here it was again, creeping back in, refusing to let him go. "And who exactly are these someones?" he pressed. Reed hesitated, then let out a quiet sigh. "The agency has been keeping tabs on you," he admitted, "not officially, of course. But there are people who remember your work, Harold. People who don't want to see you become collateral damage." Harold's stomach churned at the mention of the agency. He had spent decades as one of their most effective operatives, but the price of his loyalty had been steep. The missions, the sacrifices, the lies, it had all taken its toll. And now, even in retirement, the ghost of the agency lingered. "So, what is this really about?" Harold asked, his voice steady but his eyes sharp. "Blake, or something bigger?" Reed's lips pressed into a thin line. "It started with Blake," he admitted. "But he's just a piece of the puzzle. There's been chatter, nothing concrete yet, but enough to warrant concern. People like him, people with authority but no restraint, are being influenced. We don't know by who or why, but it's happening in small towns like this all over the country." Harold leaned back in his seat, processing Reed's words. The idea of a larger conspiracy wasn't new to him. In fact, it was almost too familiar. But the implications of it reaching into places like this, into people like Blake, made it all the more dangerous. "You think Blake's part of something bigger?" Harold asked. Reed nodded. "We suspect he's being used, manipulated. The way he targeted you, it wasn't random. Someone wanted to provoke you, to see how you'd react." Harold's eyes narrowed. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was far from comforting. If Reed was right, then his encounter with Blake wasn't just an unfortunate coincidence. It was a test, and that meant whoever was behind it already knew more about Harold than he was comfortable with. As the SUV turned onto a quieter road, Reed's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing slightly. "We're not going to my office," he said, almost to himself. "Where are we going?" Harold asked, his tone cautious. Reed hesitated, then turned to the driver. "Take us to the secondary location." Harold's instincts went on high alert. The term secondary location was never a good sign. It meant plans had changed, and not for the better. He studied Reed's face, searching for clues, but the man's expression was as guarded as ever. The SUV came to a stop in front of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building loomed in the twilight, its broken windows and rusted exterior giving it an air of foreboding. Harold stepped out of the vehicle, his senses heightened. He didn't need to ask why they were there. He could feel it. Something, or someone, was waiting for them. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the faint hum of a generator filling the otherwise silent space. Reed led the way, his movements deliberate but cautious. Harold followed, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Years of training had taught him to expect the unexpected, and this place reeked of trouble. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it, a small folder. Reed gestured for Harold to sit, but Harold remained standing, his arms crossed. "What's this?" Harold asked, nodding toward the folder. Reed's expression darkened. Intel. On Blake, and on you. Harold's stomach dropped slightly, though his face betrayed nothing. He reached for the folder, his hand steady, and opened it. Inside were photos, documents, and notes, detailed accounts of his life, both during and after his time with the agency. But it wasn't the information on him that caught his attention. It was the dossier on Blake. The officer's record was spotty, to say the least. Multiple complaints, allegations of misconduct, but nothing had ever stuck. And then there were the connections, names and places that meant nothing to an ordinary person but sent a chill down Harold's spine. These names, Harold said, pointing to a list scrawled in the margins of one of the pages. They're not random. No, they're not, Reed confirmed. We've linked several of them to covert operations, failed ones. Blake's handlers seem to have a habit of recruiting people with chips on their shoulders, people who can be easily manipulated. Harold closed the folder, his mind racing. It wasn't just about Blake. It was about control, influence, and something far more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. So what now? Harold asked, his voice low but firm. Reed looked at him, his expression serious. Now, we figure out who's pulling the strings. And we stop them before it's too late. Harold nodded, but he knew this was only the beginning. The threads of the conspiracy were tangled, and pulling on one could unravel the entire thing, or make it snap. Either way, Harold was ready. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone caught in the web, knowingly or not. And Harold wasn't about to let them go without a fight. Harold studied Reed's face, his gut telling him that there was more to the story than the polished agent was letting on. Reed was composed, almost too composed, like a man walking a tightrope with the confidence of someone who had done it 100 times before, but knew one misstep could cost him everything. Harold wasn't sure if Reed was holding back out of necessity or because he didn't fully trust him. Either way, Harold wasn't about to rely on half-truths to navigate what was clearly a dangerous game. The faint hum of the generator filled the silence as Harold processed the new information. Blake was a pawn, but in whose game? The names in the dossier pointed to something far-reaching, something that went beyond small-town power plays or even personal grudges. Harold could feel it, a dark undercurrent running beneath the surface, pulling people like Blake into its fold and using them for reasons that weren't yet clear. Reed interrupted his thoughts. There's one more thing, he said, his tone careful, almost hesitant. He pulled another sheet of paper from his pocket and handed it to Harold. It was a grainy black and white photo, clearly taken from a surveillance camera. The image showed Harold standing in front of his favorite coffee shop, unaware he was being watched. Harold's stomach tightened. How long have I been under surveillance? He asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge. It's not us, Reed said quickly. This came from a separate source. We intercepted it during an unrelated sweep. Whoever took this wasn't just watching you. They were tracking your movements, studying your routines. Harold's eyes narrowed as he stared at the photo. The timestamp was from a week ago, long before his encounter with Blake. Whoever was behind this had been laying the groundwork for some time. But why? Harold had been careful since retiring, ensuring his past wouldn't bleed into his present. Yet, here it was, clawing its way back into his life. Do you recognize the insignia in the corner? Reed asked, pointing to a small, almost imperceptible mark in the lower right corner of the photo. Harold squinted at it, his breath catching as recognition dawned. It was a symbol he hadn't seen in years. A cryptic emblem used by a covert faction that operated in the shadows of the intelligence community. They weren't officially tied to any government, but their influence stretched far and wide. Harold had encountered them once before during his career, and the memory of that mission was one he had tried to bury. They call themselves the Directive, Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're not just pulling strings. They're creating the web. Reed nodded grimly. And they've taken an interest in you. We believe they're behind Blake's actions, but that's just the surface. If they're involved, this is bigger than any of us thought. Harold felt a cold weight settle in his chest. The Directive didn't make moves unless they were calculated, precise. If they were watching him, it wasn't just out of curiosity. They wanted something, and whatever it was, it couldn't be good. The sound of footsteps echoing in the warehouse snapped Harold out of his thoughts. He turned sharply, his instincts kicking in. Reed reached for his sidearm, but Harold held up a hand, signaling him to wait. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, until a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Officer Daniels. Harold's eyes narrowed as he took in the young officer's nervous demeanor. Daniels held up his hands, a gesture of surrender, but his expression was conflicted, like a man caught between two opposing forces. "I didn't know who else to go to," Daniels said, his voice trembling slightly. "Blake's been acting strange, and it's not just him. There's something happening at the station. Files disappearing, orders that don't make sense. I think someone's controlling him, and it's bigger than we realize." Harold exchanged a glance with Reed, who nodded subtly. "What made you come here?" Harold asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Daniels hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a flash drive. "This," he said, holding it out to Harold. "It's everything I could find. Logs, communications, surveillance reports. I don't know what it all means, but Blake isn't working alone." Harold took the drive, his mind racing. Daniel's courage in coming forward was admirable, but it also painted a target on his back. If Blake, or worse, the directive, found out, the consequences could be dire. "You're in deep now," Harold said, his voice low. "There's no turning back." Daniels nodded, his face pale but determined. "I just want to do what's right." Reed took the drive from Harold, quickly plugging it into a secure device he had retrieved from the SUV. As the files loaded, the screen lit up with a dizzying array of data. Harold leaned in, scanning the information. Names, locations, coded messages. It was a trail, but where it led was still unclear. And then there it was, a name that made Harold's blood run cold. "It can't be," Harold muttered, his eyes locked on the screen. "What is it?" Reed asked, his voice tense. Harold straightened, his expression grim. "One of the directive's top operatives. I thought he was dead." Reed's face darkened. "If he's alive, this changes everything." The stakes had just been raised. Harold wasn't just dealing with a rogue officer or even a covert faction. This was personal now. The directive had brought someone from his past back into the game, and Harold knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, or destroyed him trying. The warehouse fell silent as the weight of the revelation settled over them. Harold's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of information, each one pulling him closer to an inevitable confrontation. If the directive's operative was alive, then everything Harold thought he had buried was at risk of being unearthed. And if they had sent someone from his past, they weren't just trying to manipulate him. They were targeting him directly. Reed disconnected the flash drive, his jaw tight. "If this operative is involved, we're dealing with someone who knows your every move. They'll anticipate anything we try to do." Harold nodded, his expression hard. "That's why we can't do what they expect." Daniels shifted nervously. "What does that mean? Are we going after them?" "Not exactly," Harold said, his voice calm but resolute. "They've been pulling the strings, but to what end? They didn't just plant Blake in my path for no reason. There's something bigger in play, and we need to force their hand." Reed frowned. "You're suggesting we draw them out?" Harold nodded. "If we keep reacting, they'll always be one step ahead. We need to make them think they've already won." It didn't take long to put the plan into motion. Harold, Reed, and Daniels worked quickly, using the information on the flash drive to craft a narrative that would lure the directive's operative out of hiding. They released a carefully staged leak, implying that Harold had evidence connecting the directive to high-level corruption. It was risky, but Harold knew the directive's methods. They wouldn't let such information hang in the air without taking action. Hours later, as night fell, Harold found himself back in the heart of town. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by a tense stillness. Harold stood in the dim light of a street lamp, his breath visible in the cool air. Reed and Daniels were nearby, hidden but ready to intervene if things went sideways. This was the moment of truth. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence, each one deliberate, unhurried. Harold turned slowly, his heart steady but his muscles tense. The figure that emerged from the shadows was both familiar and foreign. It was him, the operative Harold had thought long dead. His name was Victor Kane, and his presence was like a ghost materializing from Harold's past. "You've aged, Gray," Victor said, his voice smooth but tinged with mockery. "I'd almost believe you've gone soft." Harold didn't flinch. "And you're still alive. I didn't think the directive left loose ends." Victor chuckled, his smile cold. "Oh, they don't. But sometimes the right loose end can be useful. Like now." Harold kept his stance neutral, his eyes never leaving Victor's. "So, what's the play? Intimidation? Or are you here to finish something we started years ago?" Victor tilted his head, feigning thoughtfulness. "Neither, actually. You're just a piece of the puzzle, Harold. The directive doesn't care about you. They care about what you know. And if you won't give it to us willingly, well..." He gestured vaguely toward the surrounding shadows. "We have ways of making you talk." Harold smirked faintly. "You've forgotten one thing, Victor." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." Harold's voice was calm but edged with steel. "I don't play by their rules anymore. And I certainly don't play by yours." Before Victor could respond, the quiet click of Reed's comm device echoed through the earpiece Harold was wearing. "We've got them," Reed's voice said. The signal pinged their central command. "They're watching this in real time." Victor's smile faltered just slightly. Harold took a step forward, his presence suddenly more commanding. "You see, Victor, while you were so focused on pulling me into your little game, I was dismantling the board." Victor's expression darkened, his hand moving toward the concealed weapon at his side, but Harold was faster. In one fluid motion, he disarmed Victor, the weapon clattering to the ground. The operative stumbled back, his confidence cracking for the first time. "That's the difference between you and me," Harold said, his voice low. "You think power is about control. I know it's about knowing when to let go." The sound of sirens cut through the night as local law enforcement, working in tandem with Reed's team, moved in to secure the area. Victor glared at Harold, his defiance flickering even as the situation slipped out of his grasp. "This isn't over," Victor spat, his voice venomous. Harold leaned in, his tone measured but firm. "It is for you." As Victor was led away, Harold turned to Reed, who approached with a satisfied expression. "That was risky," Reed said, though there was a hint of admiration in his voice. "Risky is an understatement," Harold replied, his tone lighter now that the immediate danger had passed. "But it worked." Daniel stepped forward, looking both relieved and overwhelmed. "So, it's over." "For now," Harold said, though his eyes carried the weight of what had just transpired. He knew the directive wasn't finished, not entirely. But for the first time in a long while, Harold felt like he was ahead of the game. As the night deepened and the town slowly returned to normal, Harold stood quietly, watching the shadows fade with the dawn. The directive had tried to drag him back into their world, but he had proven that he wasn't the same man they once knew. He wasn't just a player in their game anymore. He was the one rewriting the rules.